Danger in the wild rarely announces itself, and the quiet moments people trust most can turn deadly without warning. From a lone hiker dragged into the darkness in Alaska to the truck driver crushed inside his cab on an icy Russian road, witness 6 accounts that will show you how quickly nature's power overwhelms anyone who crosses its path. On December 5th, 2025, in the frozen quiet of the Alaska interior near a remote northern mountain region, Officer Mark Thompson worked the night rotation inside the small, isolated police outpost. The structure, built for endurance rather than comfort, stood half-buried in snowdrifts that pressed along its sides like heavy white walls. As the blizzard thickened across the open tundra, Mark moved with the steady patience of someone who had learned that survival in this landscape depended on routine, caution, and measured movement rather than brute force. Lisa Reynolds sorted the day's reports at the narrow wooden desk, while Carlos Diaz checked the generator cables running along the outer wall, each of them engaged in the tired rhythm that came with long winter shifts. Nothing in their worn routine signaled what was about to break across the night, and nothing in the wind's distant howl hinted that something starving and desperate was already pushing its way toward the outpost. The blizzard had arrived earlier than expected that week, burying trails, choking ridgelines, and driving wildlife far downhill in search of anything resembling food. Among the displaced creatures was a large male grizzly, whose usual foraging ground had been sealed under layers of ice so thick that even winter-strength claws could not reach the roots trapped beneath. By the time the bear pushed through the drifts toward the outpost, its ribs showed through its fur, and its breaths came in low, guttural bursts of exhaustion and hunger. Every instinct inside the animal pulled it toward the faint smell of food and the trace of heat leaking gently from the seams of the building. As evening settled, the storm swallowed the remaining light from the sky, reducing visibility to only a few yards. The officers depended on the dull orange glow of the propane lanterns, their shadows stretching unevenly across the cramped interior. The outpost creaked under the weight of the wind, but the harsh silence still felt familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. That familiarity lulled them into the usual sense of isolation that came with winter rotations. Mark stood near the supply room, reviewing the inventory ledger, when the first impact struck the far side of the outpost, with such sudden violence that it rattled every nail in the wall and sent a burst of powdered ice through the cracks in the ceiling. For a long second, none of them understood what had happened, because the blizzard had masked every sound beyond their own breathing. Then a second impact came harder, like a moving wall slamming against timber, and the supply shed groaned as one of the outer beams split under the pressure. The Grizzly drove its weight into the shed again, forcing the wood to buckle until a portion of the roof beam cracked apart and showered the interior with splinters mixed with wind-driven ice. Carlos stumbled backward as the metal frame of the locked door shook violently under the bear's pounding paws. Each strike bent the hinges and twisted the latch, and the entire building shuddered as if being dragged sideways by an unseen force. Mark braced himself against the desk, while Lisa moved quickly toward the pile of overturned crates stacked along the rear wall, climbing upward to stay out of reach in case the barrier gave way. The bear's hunger pushed it into a frantic, unrestrained frenzy. It struck the door repeatedly, splitting the frame until wooden shards scattered across the floor. Carlos reached for the shelf where the flare gun lay, but another massive blow rocked the shed, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing to the ground. The outer panel tore loose, and a sudden blur of fur, claws, and snow burst through the opening. In the next moment, the bear slashed across Carlos's leg and shoulder, ripping through his winter jacket as if it were thin fabric and tossing him sideways across the icy floor. Lisa saw the animal shift its attention toward the movement below and climbed higher onto the crate stack with desperate determination. Her boots slipped against frost and loose packaging, but she grabbed the nearest heavy object, a propane canister with a dented rim and frozen valve. She hurled it downward with everything she had, and it struck the floor near the bear, releasing a sharp burst of pressure that hissed across the room like escaping steam. The sudden noise startled the Grizzly, making its head jerk to the side, and that brief hesitation gave the officers the narrowest sliver of time. Mark seized the moment. He forced open a heavy filing cabinet and ripped the door free from its hinge. The detached metal panel became an improvised shield as he lifted it in front of him and stepped toward Carlos with a mix of dread and determination. The bear recovered from its momentary confusion and lunged again, swinging its paw across the cabinet with tremendous force. The impact dented the metal inward and sent vibrations shooting up Mark's arms, nearly knocking him off his feet. But the shield slowed the blow just enough to keep him upright and positioned between the injured officer and the next strike. Snow swirled into the room through the broken wall, chilling everything it touched and intensifying the chaos. The bear's deep roars blended with the howl of the storm. Lisa searched frantically for anything else she could throw, but the canister had rolled out of reach and the crates were too unstable to move without risking a fall. Carlos, bleeding and fighting the cold, pressed himself against the inner wall to keep clear of the bear's path. Mark held his ground as the bear reared back again, its claws glinting under the lantern light. For several long minutes, the outpost became a confined battleground of ripping wood, dented metal, and swirling debris. The bear's breath blew out in white clouds, and every strike drained more of its remaining energy as the cold pressed deeper into its starved body. At last, the Grizzly pulled back, panting in exhaustion. As the gale roared around it, the animal turned from the wrecked entrance and lumbered back into the blizzard, disappearing behind the curtain of snow that swallowed its shape completely. Inside the ruined outpost, the officers remained frozen where they stood, shaken, bloodied and half frostbitten, surrounded by shattered beams, scattered supplies, and the jagged remnants of the struggle that had nearly ended all three of them. The long winter night closed in as the wind howled through broken seams, and the reality of how narrowly they had survived settled over them with the cold. In the deep backcountry of a remote northern island, where winter storms drifted across ridgelines like slow white tides and the land stretched outward in long frozen valleys, hunter Mark Sullivan moved carefully through the thick snowfields with his longtime companion Tyler Reed on the morning of November 18, 2024. Their boots sank into crusted powder as they followed elk tracks that cut a wandering path toward higher slopes. Nothing in the early calm suggested how quickly the day would collapse into violence, and nothing in the stillness hinted that a starving giant was already watching them from above, driven down from the rough cliffs by scarcity and hunger. The two men had hunted together for years, and although the terrain demanded respect, they trusted their combined experience and advanced with cautious steadiness, studying the tracks and reading the wind as the cold tightened around their gear and settled into the seams of their layers. Winters on the island often pushed predators into desperate patterns, especially when seasonal fish runs were poor or early storms locked the earth beneath hard snow before bears had built enough fat to endure. This year had been especially unforgiving. Rangers across the region had reported unusual movement from several large males roaming valleys weeks earlier than normal, drifting into lower basins in search of anything edible. One such bear, a massive boar with a broad scar across its hind flank from an old battle, had wandered into the same valley Mark and Tyler were now crossing. Its ribs pressed faintly through its dense coat, and its heavy frame moved with the strained, tense rhythm of an animal driven by hunger stronger than instinctive caution. The storm from the previous night had softened the elk tracks, forcing the hunters to slow their pace as they searched for fresher sign. Mark tightened the strap of his rifle, while Tyler scanned the ridge above them, watching for movement through the shifting drifts. The cold carried a muffled silence that swallowed their footsteps, giving the impression of safety, yet the bear had already picked up their scent. It moved down the slope with deliberate steps, flakes swirling around its paws as the wind pulled snow off the ridge in long white tendrils. From its higher vantage, the bear watched the men traverse the open basin below, each breath and movement feeding its building urgency as hunger pushed deeper into its instincts. As the morning progressed, the temperature dropped further, stiffening the air until each exhale fogged sharply. The hunters stopped briefly to check their bearings. When Mark shifted his pack to redistribute the weight, he heard a faint crunch above them, but in the endless background of settling snow, the sound seemed unremarkable. Tyler examined a patch of disturbed powder where elk had passed only hours earlier, believing the herd was still within reach. The true danger, however, was closing the distance at a much faster pace. The bear, driven by both starvation and relentless instinct, stepped from the ridge with sudden purpose, gathering momentum as it descended in long, powerful strides through the deep drifts. The moment the bear appeared, everything changed. A massive shadow dropped from the ridge with a speed that shattered the silence, and Mark swung his rifle upward on reflex, while Tyler froze at the sight of the charging animal. Snow erupted behind the bear as it barreled downhill, its shoulders rolling beneath thick fur and its jaws opening in a deep, booming roar that cut across the valley. Mark attempted to chamber around, but the bolt jammed halfway, locking the rifle uselessly in his hands as a surge of panic spread through him. Before he could clear it, the bear reached them, and the full force of its body slammed into him with violent momentum, carrying him off his feet and driving him into a snowbank with crushing intensity. The world narrowed into a chaotic blur of fur, snow, and weight. Mark's breath tore from his lungs as the bear raked across his torso, with claws long enough to slice through layered winter clothing, as if it were thin fabric. Tyler snapped from his shock and raised his rifle, firing a quick shot that cracked through the air. The round grazed the thick fur along the bear's shoulder, doing little more than igniting deeper fury. The animal twisted with alarming speed toward the flash of movement. Tyler fired again, the recoil jarring his arms as the second round struck the bear's flank, but the hit barely slowed it, absorbed into its dense muscle and the momentum of its rage. Pinned beneath immense weight, Mark struggled to breathe. The snow beneath him grew warm as blood spread across his layers, and the bear pressed harder, claws tearing deeper into his legs as it held him down. The violence shook loose snow from nearby branches, sending powder drifting around them in thin curtains. Tyler tried to close the distance, firing a third shot with desperate precision. The bullet tore through the air, but the bear, fueled by adrenaline and starvation, barely reacted as it continued its assault. For several long minutes, the attack raged in brutal, chaotic intensity. The bear's roars mixed with the sharp cracks of the rifle echoing across the basin. Eventually, the animal's breathing grew heavier, its strength waning from exertion and accumulated injury. It stepped back from Mark's limp form, its sides heaving. After a long, strained hesitation, it turned toward the ridge and retreated through the deep drifts with slow, staggering steps, fading into the swirling white until its outline disappeared. Tyler, trembling from a combination of shock, cold, and exhaustion, stumbled toward Mark but found him unresponsive, his injuries severe beyond recovery. Snow collected on Mark's still form as the wind swept through the valley. With fading strength and shaking hands, Tyler reached for the radio clipped to his pack, calling for rescue while the winter wind sliced through his torn layers. The temperature continued dropping as he waited, hypothermia creeping into his limbs and clouding his awareness. By the time responders reached the valley, he was barely conscious, his breath shallow and his clothing rigid with frost. They found Mark lifeless in the snow, and Tyler severely hypothermic, his body marked by the bear's initial swipe. Investigators later concluded that the combination of harsh terrain, extreme hunger driving the bear's behavior, and the malfunction of Mark's weapon created a deadly chain of events that unfolded too fast for either hunter to escape. The tragedy reinforced the unpredictable severity of the island's winter wilderness and the immense risks faced by anyone venturing into remote areas during seasons of scarcity. On May 14, 2025, along a swollen stretch of river carving through the rugged Oregon backcountry, outdoor enthusiast Sophia Lang steadied herself inside a narrow canoe as the fast spring current swept beneath her. The icy water carried the remnants of recent storms that had pushed the river far beyond its usual calm flow. Beside her, an experienced guide, David Moore, kept a firm grip on his paddle as he maneuvered around drifting logs and swirling eddies. His movements showed years of practice on unpredictable waterways, and he stayed alert, knowing that high water transformed every riverbank into unstable terrain, where footing became treacherous and visibility dropped sharply. Nothing in the smoke-gray sky or in the distant rumble of rolling water hinted that danger waited around the bend ahead, and nothing in their relaxed morning pace warned them that the forest was already hiding a startled, hungry black bear only a few yards from their intended landing site. Storms earlier that week had pushed wildlife into tight pockets along the banks where debris accumulated in tangled piles. Black bears, still recovering from winter scarcity, searched for early food in the few places where the rushing water had not erased their paths. One young adult bear, thin from the long cold months and unsettled by the constant roar of the rising river, had wandered near a muddy shoreline in hopes of finding something edible among the washed-out roots and twisted brush. The scent of food, sandwiches stored inside a brightly colored cooler, drifted along the damp air. Sophia and David didn't notice it, but the bear caught the smell through layers of wet vegetation. The canoe bumped lightly against the mud-packed bank as David guided it toward a small clearing where the river curved around a grove of dripping alders. Sophia, eager to stretch after the long paddle, stepped first onto the bank and braced herself on the unstable ground. The mud clung to her boots, pulling at her balance as she lifted the cooler and a coil of rope toward a flatter patch above the waterline. Focused on securing their gear before the current tugged the canoe back into the channel, she barely registered the faint crack of branches in the brush behind her, where the bear stood frozen in tense uncertainty, unsettled by the noise of the river and the unfamiliar scent drifting toward it. When the bear finally moved, it did so with explosive speed. It crashed through the underbrush in a burst of instinct, driven by hunger, surprise, and the overwhelming sensory pressure of the roaring river beside it. Sophia saw only a blur of dark fur before she stumbled backward, her boot sliding on the slick mud. The cooler slipped from her hands, the lid snapping open as it hit the ground, releasing a stronger wave of food scent into the air. Her fall carried her sideways into the water, where the swollen current seized her instantly. It dragged her along the irregular edge of the bank, scraping her shoulder and tearing across her leg as jagged rocks pressed through the rushing water. Cold shocked through her body as the river tried to pull her toward the deeper channel. David reacted with the instinct of someone who had seen danger emerge without warning in wild terrain, though never in a situation quite like this. He grabbed his long wooden paddle and lunged toward the river's edge, bracing himself as the muddy ground threatened to send him sliding forward. The bear, further startled by Sophia's splash and frantic movement, swung toward her as she fought to keep her head above the churning surface. Its paws tore up clumps of wet soil as it lunged again. Confusion fueled its movement more than aggression, but its weight and strength turned that confusion into immediate, life-threatening danger. David swung the paddle with all the force he could muster. The strike hit the bear across the shoulder in a heavy arc, the sound rising above the river's noise. The impact startled the animal, but didn't drive it away. Instead, it turned sharply, releasing a deep grunt as it swiped in a fast, sweeping motion meant to push the perceived threat back. The paw cut through the air and grazed Sophia as she climbed desperately toward the slope, leaving fresh welts across her scraped and bruised skin. The sudden blow forced her downward again, her hand plunging into the cold current as the water attempted to pull her back. Up on the ridge, hikers moving along a narrow trail heard the crashing brush and saw the chaotic struggle unfolding below. Realizing the danger, they hurried to a clearer vantage point and grabbed fallen branches and loose sticks from the ground. They hurled the objects toward the bear in an attempt to divert its attention without getting too close. One branch struck the ground beside the animal, another bounced off the mud near its hind leg. The noise and sudden movement broke through the bear's panic, replacing its earlier frenzy with momentary confusion. That hesitation gave Sophia a chance. Summoning the last of her strength, she pushed herself away from the water's pull and crawled toward the canoe, her bruised body trembling as the cold pressed deeper into her wet clothing. David anchored the canoe with one foot wedged into the mud and the other braced against a buried root, helping her climb in as quickly as her injured leg allowed. The bear, unsettled by the new commotion and the sharp echoes of thrown branches, turned away from the bank and retreated into the thick forest, leaving deep claw marks in the wet ground. Sophia collapsed into the canoe, shivering violently as adrenaline drained from her system. David pushed them back into the current, using the river's momentum to create distance between themselves and the shoreline. Her injuries, though not life-ending, were severe enough that each movement sent sharp pain through her shoulder, ribs, and torn leg. By the time they reached a safer landing point downstream, Sophia was pale, trembling, and barely able to stand. Medical crews later treated the deep welts, lacerations, and extensive bruising. She required stitches along her shoulder and weeks of physical therapy to regain full strength in her leg. Wildlife experts who reviewed the incident described it as a rare combination of high water, limited visibility, and unsecured food during a period when black bears searched intensely for nourishment. They emphasized that the fast reactions of both David and the nearby hikers likely prevented far more serious injuries along the unforgiving riverbank. On January 27, 2005, deep within the frozen emptiness of Svalbard's northern coast, where winter storms sculpted shifting walls of white that erased the horizon, researcher Liam O'Connor worked inside the isolated wooden cabin that served as the seasonal base for his seal population study. He moved carefully between stacks of sampling equipment while the wind hurled snow across the ice in relentless waves. His assistant, Hannah Price, sorted data sheets near a narrow window that had long since frosted into opacity, her gloved hands stiffening with each new gust that rattled the shutters. Nothing in the steady rhythm of their work hinted that something powerful, starving, and dangerously determined was already circling the small, weather-beaten structure. Nothing in the muffled interior quiet suggested how violently the night would shift from routine analysis to a desperate struggle against a predator pushed past caution by hunger and the extreme pressures of the Arctic winter. The season had been brutally harsh, locking the sea ice earlier than expected and restricting the openings where seals surfaced. Many polar bears were left with inadequate hunting opportunities during the months when fat reserves decided their survival. One enormous male, gaunt from repeated failures along the ice edge, wandered far inland in an attempt to follow any scent that might lead to food. Among the faint traces carried through the blizzard was the unmistakable smell of stored supplies seeping from the cabin's seams, just strong enough for a starving bear to detect even through the storm's smothering veil. The whiteout deepened as the hours passed, pressing drifts against the cabin until the walls groaned. Liam checked the instruments one last time before adjusting the heater, which struggled to keep the interior warm as the temperature dropped so sharply the air stung the lungs with each breath. Outside, the storm erased all evidence of terrain, turning the world into a swirling field of shapeless whiteness where even nearby objects dissolved into the blur. Through this chaos, the bear moved steadily, its massive paws nearly silent beneath the screaming wind as it approached the scent that grew stronger with every step. The first impact came without warning, a deep, cracking blow against the reinforced cabin door that shook the entire structure and sent snow cascading from the rafters. Liam and Hannah froze, listening for movement beyond the wall, though the storm's roar drowned most sound. A second strike followed, harder and more focused, cracking part of the outer boards. Driven by hunger that had eclipsed all instinct for caution, the bear pressed its bulk against the door again and again until a section of the wood splintered. The cabin shuddered violently as the bear finally pushed open a gap in the frame. Part of the door tore free, and the interior was instantly flooded with icy wind and snow. The bear's massive white form surged into the small space, eyes fixed on the nearest movement. Equipment toppled beneath its weight. The animal's breath came in heavy, steaming bursts against the frigid air as it sniffed the room, searching for the food that had drawn it here. Liam lunged for the emergency flare gun, his hands shaking as adrenaline surged. He fired a single shot toward the ceiling. The flare erupted in a burst of red sparks, illuminating every frantic detail. For a moment, the bear recoiled, startled by the sudden brightness, but its hunger and confusion quickly overcame caution. It lunged again, striking Liam across the chest and hurling him backward into a corner. Snow fell from the broken doorway, mixing with equipment fragments as the impact drove the breath from his lungs. Hannah acted instinctively. She grabbed the heaviest storage box nearby and shoved it between Liam and the bear, managing to delay the animal's advance just long enough to pull Liam behind a reinforced table. The bear swiped again, grazing her arm with its claws, leaving a long, bloody gash. Pain seared through her, but she forced herself to remain calm, knowing any panic could provoke a renewed attack. She yelled repeatedly, firing a second flare toward the ceiling, the sparks lighting the room in jagged bursts that danced across the walls. The bear, frustrated by the barriers and bright flashes, shifted its attention to Liam again. With a sudden, powerful swipe, it knocked over the table and scattered the remaining instruments. Liam, severely injured but still conscious, attempted to crawl toward a corner, while Hannah used her remaining strength to block the bear's path. She realized that the animal's movements were clumsy inside the confined space. Its size, normally an advantage, now made it difficult to maneuver. Minutes stretched like hours. The storm outside howled, snow pelting the shattered doorway. Then finally, the bear paused. Its sides heaved as it reassessed the cramped room. Hannah, recognizing her chance, fired a final flare. The light and sudden heat seemed to convince the predator that the cabin was too dangerous, and with one final snort, it retreated back through the open doorway into the storm, disappearing almost instantly into the blinding white. Silence fell, broken only by the wind forcing snow across the ruined floor. Liam lay near the overturned table, unable to move freely due to the trauma to his chest and the debris pinning him down. Hannah, though bleeding and in shock, forced herself to check him and drag him closer to the wall. She managed to reach the radio and call the base camp, her voice hoarse but intelligible over the static. Rescue teams were dispatched immediately, navigating the storm to reach the remote cabin. When they arrived, they found Liam unconscious and severely injured. Despite the medical team's efforts, his injuries were too catastrophic to survive. Hannah, though wounded, had persevered. Her detailed account of the attack became the primary source for investigators, who noted the combination of extreme isolation, severe weather, escaping food scent, and the bear's starvation had created a rare but deadly situation. Her survival ensured that the story could be recounted accurately, a cautionary tale for future Arctic researchers. Authorities later reinforced guidance for field teams: always ensure multiple exits, maintain constant communication, and minimize scent trails from food. Hannah returned home, her experience a haunting memory, yet a reminder that even in the most remote wilderness, survival often depended on quick thinking, vigilance, and a measure of luck. On February 9, 2008, truck driver Ivan Petrov guided his slow, deliberate path along a narrow dirt road, cutting through the deep forests of Russia's Amur region. The winter air was sharp enough to sting his lungs with every breath, and thin webs of frost clung to the windshield, despite the heater's effort to keep the cab warm. The road, bordered by dense stands of fir and larch, had turned treacherous overnight. Long sheets of ice stretched across the narrow track, forcing him to keep both hands firmly locked on the wheel, while the truck's worn chains clattered in a steady rhythm beneath the tires. Nothing in the calm, pale morning light suggested danger. Nothing in the still, breathless forest hinted that a starving grizzly had been pacing the woodland shadows, driven to reckless boldness by hunger and the brutal pressures of the season. Winters in the region often pushed wildlife into unpredictable patterns, But this year's early snowfalls had buried feeding grounds and sealed the last remaining remnants of autumn beneath a hardened crust. The grizzly moving through the trees that morning was an enormous male whose territory had been stripped bare by the deep freeze. He had wandered far from familiar ground after repeated failures along river corridors, leaving behind long, purposeful tracks that cut across the snow. Prey had become scarce, and the gnawing desperation that replaced caution had worn away his usual instinct to avoid roads and the noise of human machines. Through the stillness, the distant hum of Ivan's truck carried faint vibrations that stirred something urgent inside the bear. The scent of fuel, food, and human presence floated toward him on the weak morning wind. Ivan leaned forward as the truck crested a modest rise, adjusting his speed while the path dropped into a straight, icy stretch hemmed tightly by winter-dark forest. His breath fogged the inside of the cab, and he wiped condensation from the corner of the window with the back of his glove to keep his view clear. Radio signals had vanished hours earlier, leaving him alone with the steady thrum of the engine and the subtle creaks of cold metal expanding as the temperature continued to fall. Snow drifted in soft, whispering sheets across the road, and the forest towered silently on either side, its weighted branches bending beneath thick layers of frost. The grizzly spotted the truck before Ivan noticed movement in the tree line. The animal's hulking shape blended into the pale shadows as it paced parallel to the road, muscles coiled beneath its thinning winter coat. Something, a combination of engine rumble, food scent, and instinctive urgency, triggered a sudden surge of determination within the animal. It plunged through the trees with startling speed, snow erupting beneath its paws as it raced toward the narrow road. The first impact struck the passenger side with explosive force, jostling the truck violently and sending it sliding across the icy surface. Metal groaned, and glass erupted when the window shattered. Ivan wrestled to correct the skid, gripping the wheel with trembling hands as the vehicle swung dangerously toward a steep ditch. The bear struck again, dragging its claws across the door in a relentless display of force fueled by starvation and instinct. Reinforced metal, already compromised by age and rust, buckled under repeated blows. With one swipe, the animal tore through the door, raking Ivan's shoulder and chest and forcing him against the seatbelt. Pain shot through him, searing as he fought to breathe. Warm blood seeped down his side, mixing with cold sweat beneath his heavy winter layers. Ivan attempted to steady the wheel, but his vision blurred from shock and pain. The bear's weight rocked the cab again, pushing the truck perilously close to the edge of the ditch. The cold air rushing through the shattered window bit into his skin, and every breath came in ragged gasps. But then, a stroke of luck arrived. A nearby logging crew working several hundred meters down the forest road had seen the commotion from their lookout cabin. One of the workers, Dmitri, had spotted the bear charging the vehicle and immediately ran toward the scene with a flare gun in hand. His arrival distracted the bear just long enough that it paused, growling and snorting at the sudden human presence. Seeing no easy path forward and sensing danger, the animal retreated back into the trees, disappearing into the snow-laden forest. Dmitri helped Ivan crawl from the cab, noting that though he was severely injured, he was alive. Emergency services arrived shortly after, transporting Ivan to the nearest hospital. He sustained deep lacerations and a broken rib, but he survived thanks to the timely intervention of a witness who had been alert and nearby. Investigators later concluded that a combination of remote setting, treacherous ice, extreme winter conditions, and the bear's starvation-driven aggression had formed a deadly chain of events the moment the first impact struck. Ivan's survival owed entirely to Dmitri's presence, and his first-hand testimony became the primary source for understanding the incident. The story served as a sobering reminder. Winter roads in deep Russian forests could become lethal in moments when human isolation and desperate wildlife converged. The local forestry service later reinforced guidelines for drivers in the region. Avoid traveling alone on isolated forest roads during severe winters. Maintain communication devices and carry deterrents for wildlife encounters. Ivan eventually returned home, haunted by the memory, but grateful that his story, and Dmitri's timely witness, would provide lessons for others navigating the dangerous frozen expanses of Amur's forests. In the early autumn of 2021, as the forests of the Carpathian region settled into cooler days and long, quiet evenings, hikers Andrei Popescu and Ioana Marin made their way along a narrow trail that wound through spruce stands and moss-covered stones. They moved at an unhurried pace, unaware that the stretch of woodland ahead held far greater danger than anything they had encountered before. Nothing they had passed so far hinted at what waited just beyond the next bend. The air carried the scent of damp needles and decaying leaves, and the faint rustle of small animals in the underbrush blended with the distant murmur of running water. The atmosphere was calm enough to encourage a sense of safety, leading them to pause without fully considering the risks that accompanied stopping in an area frequented by large wildlife searching for food as the season shifted toward colder weather. The Carpathian Mountains had long been a region where human presence mixed uneasily with wild animals, particularly in the forested valleys where Eurasian brown bears roamed in search of berries, roots, and anything else that would help them build the fat reserves required for winter survival. This section of the range, dense with tangled undergrowth and threaded with winding streams, attracted hikers who often underestimated how silently a bear could emerge from cover. Andrei and Ioana, both casual hikers with limited experience in wilderness environments, followed a narrow stream until they reached a flat, rocky patch where the water collected in a shallow basin. Sunlight filtered intermittently through the tree canopy, and the calm surface of the pool reflected the arching branches overhead. They decided to take a photograph of themselves before continuing toward a nearby ridge, thinking it would capture the gentle beauty of the setting. As Andrei stepped closer to the water's edge and lifted his phone, he tried to angle the shot to include the length of the winding stream behind them. Ioana shifted her backpack and moved slightly to his left, adjusting her position to avoid the glare of light breaking through the leaves. Neither hiker realized that a large Eurasian brown bear had been moving along the same waterway for several minutes, browsing among the dense vegetation on the opposite bank. The steady sound of flowing water masked the bear's movements, and the direction of the wind carried the hiker's scent away from the animal, depriving both sides of any natural warning. The attack began without any signal, leaving no moment for either hiker to understand what had triggered the sudden eruption of motion in the underbrush. The bear surged forward at a speed that defied its massive size, pushing through a thick screen of ferns and saplings as it crossed the narrow gap between forest and stream. Andrei heard only the heavy thud of paws striking the ground a split second before the bear collided with him, knocking him backward onto slick, lichen-coated rocks. His phone slipped from his hand, clattering briefly before disappearing into the shallow water. The crushing weight of the animal drove the breath from his lungs, and the world constricted into a blur of splashing water, the harsh grunt of the bear, and the rising panic in his chest. The bear's first swipe tore through the fabric of Andrei's hiking pants, cutting deeply into the muscle of his thigh. A second blow raked across his shoulder as he struggled under the immense pressure pinning him to the rocks. Ioana, already stumbling backward in shock, slid across the wet stones. She tried to steady herself with one hand against a protruding tree root, but her balance failed, and she fell onto her side. Her backpack snagged on a broken limb, jerking her off-center as she attempted to scramble away. With a sudden, brutal motion, the bear turned toward her. Its paw slashed through the straps of her pack, carving a deep tear across the nylon. The force of the impact pushed her into the mud, leaving her momentarily unable to breathe. She heard the sound of ripping fabric and snapping buckles behind her as the half-destroyed pack slid off her shoulder. Crawling toward a cluster of rocks, she felt her hands slip in the wet soil, and the vibration of the bear's movement pulsed faintly through the ground. She understood that even the smallest hesitation would cost her more than whatever gear the pack still held. Andrei, bleeding heavily and barely able to move, reached instinctively for the trekking pole secured to his wrist loop. Pain radiated through his injured leg, slowing every motion, but he managed to free the pole and swing it once. The strike landed against the side of the bear's snout. It had little power behind it, offering no real defense, but the unexpected contact startled the animal. That momentary distraction gave Ioana several precious seconds to drag herself farther up the bank. Water from the stream carried streaks of Andrei's blood downstream as he tried to lift the pole again, his grip weakening steadily. Disoriented by the blow, the bear paused, breathing heavily as it scanned the area near the water. It stepped toward Andrei, then abruptly shifted its weight and retreated toward the forest with the same suddenness with which it had appeared. In only moments, the woods regained their earlier stillness, though the hikers remained sprawled across the wet stones and soft earth, shaken and badly injured. Ioana reached Andrei shortly afterward, her hands trembling as she tried to examine the damage. His leg had been torn open along the side, and deep scratches ran across his shoulder and ribs. She felt the growing ache of severe bruising along her own ribs and arms, reminders of the bear's swipes and the fall she had taken. Their belongings were scattered along the bank, and what remained of her backpack hung in strips from a broken branch. Emergency crews, alerted by hikers farther down the trail who had heard the commotion, arrived only after a difficult climb. They stabilized Andrei's leg, applied compression bandages, and treated Ioana's lacerations and bruising before escorting them down the mountain for medical care. Both survived the attack, though physical recovery required months, and the memory of the encounter remained far longer. Investigators later concluded that the combination of seasonal food availability near streams, limited visibility in dense forest, and hikers stopping for photos created a setting where bears could appear unexpectedly and react unpredictably to human presence. The incident reinforced long-standing warnings. Approaching or photographing wildlife, especially in bear-inhabited regions, could transform a moment of carelessness into a sudden, life-threatening event.